We are wrapping up this morning the message series that I've been doing for the last several weeks or so, Sibling Rivalries from the Old Testament, by talking about the story of Jacob's sons and the sibling rivalry between Joseph and his brothers. Now last week, if you were here, you may remember that we examined the sibling rivalry between the sisters, Leah and Rachel, and this bizarre competition to see who could generate the most children for Jacob, in an attempt to win over his love and respect. Well, that resulted in 12 sons and one daughter from 4 wives that he was married to all at the same time. Well, in today's story, we really find the story of the 12 sons that came out of those relationships. The story begins when Joseph, the second youngest, is 17. Now, John read the account leading up to Joseph's life barely being spared and his being sold into slavery by his brothers. And I could take quite a bit of time just kind of sharing and talking about why Joseph, maybe all of the things that he shared didn't exactly help his brother's view of him. However, because I want to cover a fair amount of ground in this story from Joseph and his brothers, in a short period of time, we're going to jump right ahead to the end of chapter 37, where John finished. When Joseph arrives in Egypt and ends up a servant in the household of a man named Potiphar. Now, Potiphar was the captain of the Egyptian guard, the elite soldiers tasked with protecting the Pharaoh, the Egyptian king. So Potiphar would have been a high-ranking military leader, very close to the Pharaoh, and very, very powerful. The town that I grew up in had a little pizza place that I used to like to go up to when I was a kid, and I still remember on the wall of Mr. G's Pizza, it had a little sign, and there was a rule, management's rules, it said. Rule number 1 was the boss is always right. And rule number 2 was, if the boss is wrong, see rule number 1, right? Well, that reminds me of what we're going to see again and again in this story of Joseph and his brothers. Except rule number 1 is, God has a plan for us, and He will fulfill it. And rule number 2 is, if it looks like there is no plan, see rule number 1. And many times, God works that plan in the midst of less than desirable situations. Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery. They almost killed him. He forcibly gets taken to Egypt. And even though Joseph could not see it at the time, God was working. Now, it's not that everything that happened to Joseph was good. It's that God was working through it anyway. And lo and behold, Joseph ends up a servant in the house of a close aide to the king of Egypt, who was at the time the most powerful person on earth. Coincidence? I think not. Well, as the story goes on over in chapter 39 of Genesis, God is really blessing Joseph. Even Potiphar, the guy that he's basically a servant of in his home, can see this. And so Potiphar elevates Joseph and makes him kind of a personal attendant or assistant. Places Joseph over his entire household, probably his finances, everything, property, servants, everything except Potiphar himself. Now Joseph can begin to see, maybe God is working through all this. However, Joseph's a good-looking, well-built young guy, and Potiphar's wife starts thinking about Joseph in ways that she shouldn't be. She wants to have an affair with Joseph and tries to get him to give in to her advances time and time again. And yet he is faithful to God, and he resists. More than anything else, in fact, I would suggest Joseph wants to be faithful to God. And that really is the number 1 requirement to be confident that God's plans and purposes for our lives will indeed come to pass. That we are striving always to be faithful. Well, unfortunately, one day Potiphar's wife kind of corners Joseph and grabs his shirt, his outer clothing, whatever he was wearing, and he runs off and she grabs a hold of it, so she's got it in her hand, and she goes to her husband, claiming that, look what he has done. She's irritated that he's not given in to her advances, and so she goes to her husband and claims that Joseph has made an advance on her. Well, Joseph gets put in prison. He loses his elevated status, these incredible privileges that he has been experiencing in the household of Potiphar. Obviously, God's plan has been derailed. God has failed, right? Well, Joseph wasn't put into any old prison. Joseph was put into a prison that was especially reserved for those who had committed wrongs against the king and were awaiting trial. And verses 20 through 23 in Genesis 39 make very clear what God is doing. It says, "But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did." Boy, this young man who is seeking with all of his heart to live faithfully for God, we're seeing a pattern here in how God is using him. The prisoner has become the warden. Well, not exactly. Joseph is still in prison. But kind of like in the home of Potiphar, now everything is under Joseph's guidance and control. Remember the two rules. Rule number one, God has a plan for us, and if we are faithful, he will fulfill it. Rule number two, if it looks like there is no plan, see rule number one. Well, time goes by, and sometime later, two key people in the king's household, the chief cupbearer, basically the king's food and drink tester, and the chief baker, the king's cook, end up in prison for something that they had done that offended the king. Somehow they had gotten in trouble, and so now they're in this prison awaiting trial. Joseph is assigned to them to make sure that they're cared for, that their needs are met while they're waiting for their trials. And they both have these really strange dreams. So the next morning, Joseph goes in, and he's doing his daily rounds with these two guys, tending to their needs, making sure they're okay. And they're acting particularly sad. And he asks them, what's going on? Why are you so sad looking? And they tell him about these dreams. Well, lo and behold, Joseph knows a thing or two about dreams. Remember, he had already gotten some and had maybe not shared them in the best ways with his family, but he had gotten an accurate read of what God was saying to him. So he interprets both the dreams. Now, the interpretation of the cupbearer's dream is that he's going to be reinstated in the house of the king and have his old cushy job back. And Joseph tells the guy, oh, and when that happens, please don't forget about me. I've done nothing to be in this prison. And next, the king's baker tells him his dream, and the interpretation Joseph gives him isn't quite so exciting. This interpretation is that in 3 days the king will have his head chopped off and his body hung on a tree, and the birds will eat his flesh. Yikes. I'll bet that didn't make the cook's day. But guess what? Both interpretations come true. Now, unfortunately, the cupbearer guy forgets all about Joseph when he gets back into his nice cushy job, and Joseph sits there for another 2 full years. That would have been real easy during those 2 years for Joseph to begin to lose hope and assume that God must not have a plan after all. God must not know what he's doing. God must not be working here. But that would have been a mistake. For 2 years later, Pharaoh himself had 2 very strange dreams. In one of them, 7 skinny, starved-looking cows literally eat 7 other big, healthy cows, but are still skinny. And in the other, 7 thin and scorched heads of grain on a stalk somehow swallow up 7 other healthy, more full grains on a stalk, a different stalk, but are still thin and scorched afterward. Now the king believes that these dreams are somehow a message, but he can't put his finger on it, and no one in the whole kingdom can tell him what they mean. Then the king's cupbearer, still in his cushy job, remembers Joseph, this guy from 2 years earlier, who had interpreted both his dream and the dream of the king's baker, and both had come true. And he shares that with the Pharaoh. So after 2 years of waiting for God to act, 2 more years, the king sends for Joseph to be brought from the dungeon, from the prison. And when he first gets there, the Pharaoh asks Joseph, think of this, the most powerful person in the world, and the king asks Joseph, asks you if you were there, can you interpret dreams? And you're thinking, well, I say, man, if I get this wrong, I'm in trouble. But before answering, Joseph responds then, I love this, listen to this, Genesis 41, verse 16, I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answers he desires. So in addition to striving to be faithful to God, the other requirement, as I see from this story, to be confident that God's plans and purposes for our lives will come to pass and that we'll experience God's blessing, is that we always give God the credit for what he does in our lives, to give him the credit for the gifts and the talents that you have received. It's so easy to take credit, but to give that to God, to give God the credit for the blessings, for the good things that you experience in your life. See, Joseph, who has remained faithful even in very difficult times, and is now giving God the credit for what God is about to do in his life, gets honored by God. Joseph listens to the king tell these dreams about the cows and the head of grain, and gives the king this interpretation. There will be 7 years of great abundance, where everything will grow wonderfully and there will be lots of food. But then will come 7 years of famine, and food will be so scarce that the 7 good years will be completely forgotten. No one will remember the good years, because it will be so bad. All they will remember will be hunger and death. Joseph then gives them instructions on how to prepare for those 7 years of famine so that there will be food when this terrible time comes. And then Joseph tells the Pharaoh that they need to find someone to oversee both the setting aside of food during the good years and the distribution of food when the famine years come. After Joseph finished, listen to the response in verses 37 through 40 of Genesis chapter 41. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? And then Pharaoh says to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You will be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. Oh my goodness. After being hated by his own brothers, thrown in a well and left for dead, sold into slavery, attempts to seduce him, unfairly being put in prison for something that he did not do, and in fact for doing what God would desire, left there for at least 2 full years. Now, in God's time, he is the second most powerful person on earth. Now, the plan really comes into view. Later, during the 7 years of famine, Joseph's brothers come to Egypt looking for food. To make a long story short, Joseph reveals himself to them. You can read the rest of this fascinating account in Genesis chapter 42 and following, but I will say that when Joseph reveals to them, understandably, they are terrified. This brother that they basically left for dead is now just shy of the most powerful person on earth, and the one with the authority to either provide or not provide food for their family to keep them from starving during this terrible famine. Now, if you were in Joseph's shoes, if I was in Joseph's shoes, wouldn't you want to rub it in just a little bit after all you'd experienced with your brothers? Well, he sort of did just a little bit. You can read the rest of the story. But he didn't hold a grudge. He loved them. And I love it. He says that this young man who was growing immensely in his relationship with God who was faithful to God during challenging times, who gave God the credit for what God had done in his life. He says to his brothers, you know what? You didn't really do this to me. It was a part of God's plan to take care of you during this difficult time and ensure that God's promise of generations to come would in fact come to pass. So go, bring the family, and come stay with me. Friends, God had a plan for Joseph since Joseph was a fertilized egg inside Rachel's belly. God had a plan for Joseph even when Joseph was stuck in the bottom of a well, left for dead. God had a plan for Joseph when Joseph was sold into slavery and hauled away hundreds and hundreds of miles from his home with his mother and father thinking that he had been devoured by a wild animal. God had a plan for Joseph when he was rotting in a dungeon for more than 2 years for doing what was right before God. God had always had a plan for Joseph, even when it didn't look like it. And now, finally, after years of being in the dark as to what God was up to, but because he was faithful, and because he never stopped giving God the credit for everything in his life, Joseph was second in command of the entire kingdom of Egypt, second only to the Pharaoh himself, and in a position to extend God's care to his entire family. Now Joseph can begin to see how God had been working through all those terrible events that he had experienced over those years in his life. Yes, friends, God had a plan for Joseph, and it came to pass. And I want to contend this morning and suggest and impress upon us that God has a plan and plans for our lives. God has a plan for our church. God has a plan and plans in the lives of your family and your workplace and your social settings. God has plans to bless you and to use you to make an impact in our world in the name of Christ. And even when it doesn't feel like there is a plan, when you're experiencing a challenge or a hardship, I believe that if you are striving to be faithful, you can be confident beyond a shadow of a doubt that God is at work. Even when it feels maybe like you've been abandoned, when you aren't sure where to turn next, still seek to remain faithful to God, always giving him the credit for the good in your life, and know that something good is coming that will bless you, bless others through you, and maybe, as was the case of Joseph, bless the entire world. Rule number 1, God has a plan for your life, and if you are faithful, he will fulfill it. Rule number 2, if it looks like there is no plan, see rule number 1. Let's pray. Dear God, we thank you so much for your presence in our lives, and we thank you for the confidence that in easy times, in challenging times, in all times, Lord, if we strive to the best of our ability to be faithful to you, to seek your ways, to give you the credit for what you have done, are doing, will do in our lives, the blessings that we experience, God, that you will remain faithful, that you are working, that you are with us, and that God, in your time, those plans to bless us and bless others through us will indeed be fulfilled. Dear God, I pray that you would be with us this day and help us to realize that because you loved us so much, you sent your one and only Son to die for our sins, so that we might know a life with you in this world, where your plans and purposes as we yield ourselves to you indeed come to pass. And God, even one day looking forward to coming into your very presence, never to be separated again. God, may we cling to those confidences. May we hold those hopes near and dear to our heart. And may we know that if we are seeking you, sometimes, God, even when we aren't so closely, thank you, we will experience your plans and purposes lived out in our lives. God, bring them on. Fill our lives with your presence, your power, and allow us to live into all that you have created and planned for us to be